As a business journalist, I think you need to have a strong critical sense. And I think like the problem a lot with business journalists is that they're not critical enough. Often they're not skilled enough to be able to question a company based on its financials properly. They don't quite know what this means. They accept jargon for what it means and don't say to them, well, what are you actually trying to say? Because businessmen cloak jargon, cloak what they want to say in jargon if they want to confuse you. So if you're trying to get to a sense of whether a company is doing bad things or whether it's doing what it shouldn't or deceiving shareholders or deceiving the public, they always do that. They always use jargon when they don't want to show something. So skills obviously is a big issue for a lot of younger journalists. They don't have the skills to decode a lot of that. But then I think the desire to adopt a critical viewpoint and say, well, explain this to me. I mean, explain what you're trying to say here is something that I suppose it comes with confidence, but it's something that I think business journalists need more of. Well, there have been some great investigations. Angola's done a couple of great ones on the banking system there in Mozambique. Obviously, Carlos Cardoso was killed in Mozambique, investigating banks and the president's son. And the president's son actually was involved in that case. So there have been some great investigations. The mines up in Malawi, I think I've read some great stuff recently on that. So it's not as if there aren't people doing it, but part of the problem is that the access to information laws aren't applied by governments as often as they should. And a lot of the time journalists don't use the access to information laws like they should to prize information out of companies. So I do think that there is some good journalism, some good investigative journalism, but it is fairly new and fairly infrequent. Well, I think the problem is that, we need proper transparency. Any good journalism requires transparency, and it requires people to ask questions when something isn't being shown to you, when they think something is wrong. And if your access to information laws and your government transparency and your private sector transparency aren't what it should be, you're not going to get the information you want. So it's up to journalists to demand that kind of thing. I think that it depends on the skills of the individuals. There's some amazingly huge companies now operating across Africa. Nigeria has got some immense companies, a lot of foreign companies operating in Africa. Walmart came into South Africa now owns Massmart. There's some companies that we should demand more answers of, but the problem is that we don't often do that, and part of it is that most business journalists have often been fairly hagiographical. That's fairly uncritical views of what a great and esteemed leader this guy is, without saying, well, what has he actually done? Not enough research and just a desire to puff the guy's egos. There's certainly the way in which companies like MTN, which is essentially Africa's biggest cell phone company, headquartered in Johannesburg, which the case where they've gone into different countries and had to abide by their rules, which entailed some things that wouldn't sit well with people, providing government information on citizens to governments. And some questions were asked in Iran. I mean, people asked MTN, are you effectively providing government with the means to spy on your citizens? So there's some questions about how companies operate in emerging markets where the governments aren't quite as democratically minded as you'd imagine. So there are stories like that demand to be told. There's stories like the rise of China and how China has compromised certain governments to provide mineral rights in some countries. And if the media is not looking the right way, those things will happen completely in the background and no one will know the better. There are great stories that are told. That Angolan story, for example, others I've seen recently. But it's a question of how closely the media is paying attention to that, and also whether these stories gain national traction. Barry Tannenbaum is this guy who put together the biggest con in this country's history. He essentially told people he was importing components that go into AIDS drugs and going to make them 2,000% a year return on their money. So guys put in 12 billion, I think was the last figure, 12 billion rand, which is $1.2 billion. It's an immense load of money. And it was a straight scam. It was quite satisfying to break that story and write the book about it, I suppose. And Dina Pule getting rid of a corrupt minister, telecoms minister. Some other stories like that, Sambo. What happened in the case of Sambo? It was a case of a bank, one of our biggest banks, I think our sixth largest, and how it went bust. And people are very protective. The business press is very protective over CEOs. So when we started asking questions about it, we had all manner of recrimination from the Reserve Bank to people who don't like to rock the boat. So it was quite a telling lesson for me early on that these guys will almost step out of their way to I wouldn't say cover up bad guys, but certainly you can find an excuse for these bad guys. Blue Financial Services was a company that gave loans right across Africa, and we raised questions about how it was doing it, and eventually it just completely imploded. And there were big question marks over the strategy and the financial structuring. So I think, I suppose the stories that I like are putting bad guys on the spot and exposing things that shouldn't happen. But I think it ultimately comes from taking a critical view of what's going on. I think that's, to my mind, that's the lesson for journalists, is to be more critical in the way they approach stories.